Almost every rent versus buy comparison you will find, whether from a real estate agent, a mortgage calculator, or a well-meaning relative, runs the same incomplete version of the math. Compare your monthly rent to your monthly mortgage payment, and whichever number is lower wins. This comparison leaves out, by one count, at least 7 significant cost categories on the ownership side alone, and at least one major cost category that most renters never account for on their own side either. Leaving these out does not produce a neutral, simplified estimate. It systematically and predictably biases the conclusion toward buying, because almost all of the omitted costs sit specifically on the ownership side of the ledger. This video runs the complete, honest version of this comparison. Every cost category that actually belongs on each side, in the order they typically get forgotten, and the one specific number, more than any other single variable, that actually determines whether buying or renting comes out ahead in your specific city, at your specific price point. This is not a video arguing that renting is better than buying, or that buying is better than renting. It is a video giving you the complete framework so you can run the real numbers for your own specific situation, because reasonable, well-informed people running the complete math honestly land on both sides of this decision, depending on their city, their time horizon, and their specific circumstances. Here are the 7 cost categories that belong on the ownership side of this comparison, beyond the mortgage payment itself, in roughly the order they tend to be forgotten. Cost 1. Property tax. A genuinely required recurring cost paid to your municipality, typically ranging from approximately 0.5% to 1.5% of a home's assessed value annually, depending on the specific municipality, meaning a $600,000 home might carry $3,000 to $9,000 per year in property tax alone. A cost a renter never pays directly, though it is, in practice, embedded in the rent a landlord charges, a nuance covered in Segment 3. Cost 2. Home insurance. Required by virtually all mortgage lenders and a genuine ongoing cost even after a mortgage is paid off, typically ranging from several hundred to over $1,000 annually, depending on the home's value, location, and coverage level. Cost 3. Maintenance and repairs. A commonly cited financial planning rule of thumb estimates ongoing maintenance and repair costs at approximately 1% to 2% of a home's value annually, covering everything from routine maintenance, furnace servicing, gutter cleaning, to eventual major repairs, roof replacement, HVAC system replacement, that virtually every home requires over a sufficiently long ownership period. On a $600,000 home, this is approximately $6,000 to $12,000 per year, averaged over time. Some years will have minimal costs, others will have a single large expense. Cost 4. CMHC mortgage insurance, if applicable. For Canadian buyers with a down payment of less than 20% of the purchase price, mortgage default insurance, commonly through CMHC, though private insurers also offer this, is mandatory, adding a premium, typically in the range of 1.5% to 4% of the mortgage amount, depending on the loan-to-value ratio, that is either paid up front or added to and amortized within the mortgage itself, increasing the total interest paid over the life of the loan. Cost 5. Land transfer tax and closing costs. A one-time but often substantial cost at the time of purchase, varying significantly by province and municipality, Ontario and British Columbia, including certain municipalities like Toronto, which layers an additional municipal land transfer tax on top of the provincial one, have notably higher rates than several other provinces. Combined with legal fees, home inspection costs, and other closing costs, this commonly totals 1.5% to 4% of the purchase price, paid entirely up front and not recovered. Cost 6. Condo or strata fees, if applicable. For condominium ownership specifically, monthly fees covering building maintenance, reserve funds, and shared amenities are a mandatory, ongoing cost that can range from a few hundred to well over $1,000 monthly, depending on the building, amenities, and age of the reserve fund, a cost with no direct equivalent in a comparable rental unit's stated rent, though, again, it is embedded in what a landlord charges. Cost 7. The opportunity cost of the down payment itself. This is the cost category covered in full depth in Segment 4, because it is large enough and frequently overlooked enough to warrant its own dedicated treatment. But it deserves at least a placeholder here. A down payment is capital that, if not used for a home purchase, could instead be invested, and the foregone investment return on that capital is a genuine, calculable cost of the decision to buy. Why these costs are so consistently forgotten? Real estate marketing, by its nature, tends to emphasize the monthly mortgage payment specifically because it is the number most directly comparable to a monthly rent figure, creating an apples-to-oranges comparison that flatters homeownership by omission, not necessarily by deliberate intent in every case, but with a systematically predictable directional bias regardless. Your action step. For any home you are seriously considering, calculate your own version of costs 1 through 6 specifically. Cost 7 is covered separately in Segment 4, using the percentage ranges provided and your specific province's rates, and add this total to the advertised mortgage payment before making any comparison to a rental alternative. Here is the vault from the opening. The one number, more than any other single variable, that determines whether buying or renting tends to come out ahead in your specific city. It is called the price-to-rent ratio, calculated by dividing a home's purchase price by its annual rent for a comparable property. A $600,000 home that would rent for $2,500 per month, $30,000 per year, has a price-to-rent ratio of 20, $600,000 divided by $30,000. Why this ratio matters so much? A lower price-to-rent ratio generally favors buying, because the home is relatively inexpensive to purchase relative to what it would cost to rent the equivalent property, meaning the mortgage and ownership costs are more likely to be offset by the rent you would otherwise be paying. A higher price-to-rent ratio generally favors renting because the home is relatively expensive to purchase relative to its rental value, meaning a large amount of capital is required to avoid a comparatively modest rent payment, leaving that capital's opportunity cost, covered in Segment 4, to weigh more heavily on the comparison. Commonly cited general reference ranges, used broadly across North American real estate analysis, though not a precise scientific threshold, and subject to reasonable disagreement. A price-to-rent ratio below approximately 15 is generally considered to favor buying meaningfully. A ratio between approximately 15 and 20 is considered closer to neutral, with the decision depending more heavily on individual circumstances and time horizon. A ratio above approximately 20, and especially above 25, is generally considered to favor renting, all else equal, because the price being paid relative to the rental value has become stretched relative to historical norms. The Canadian reality. Several major Canadian markets, particularly Toronto and Vancouver, have historically carried price-to-rent ratios meaningfully above 20 and at various points above 25 to 30 in significant portions of their respective markets, placing them, by this commonly used framework, in territory that has historically favored renting from a purely financial perspective, even though the cultural and psychological pull toward homeownership in Canada remains strong regardless of what this specific ratio suggests. Other Canadian markets, certain mid-sized cities and many smaller towns, as covered in this channel's housing crisis video, carry meaningfully lower price-to-rent ratios, placing them in territory that more frequently favors buying by this same framework. The crucial caveat: this ratio is one important, well-established input, not the entire decision. It does not account for your personal time horizon. A longer expected holding period generally favors buying, even at a higher ratio, because fixed transaction costs get spread over more years, covered further in Segment 3. Your specific tax situation, your risk tolerance, or the non-financial factors covered in Segment 5. Your action step: calculate the price-to-rent ratio for a specific home you are considering by dividing its purchase price by the annual rent of a genuinely comparable rental property in the same neighborhood. This single number gives you a fast, well-established first read on which side of the decision the pure financial math is more likely to favor in your specific case. This comparison is not one-sided. Renters commonly make their own version of an incomplete calculation, and homeownership advocates raise one specific counterargument that deserves a direct, honest answer: the hidden cost most renters overlook. Rent itself is not fixed, and home ownership payments, the mortgage principal and interest portion specifically, are. A fixed-rate mortgage's principal and interest payment remains constant for the duration of the fixed-rate term, while rent, in the absence of rent control or a similar mechanism, typically rises over time with inflation and local market conditions. A renter comparing today's rent to today's mortgage payment without projecting forward is making an incomplete comparison in the opposite direction from the ownership side omissions covered in Segment 1. Because the renter's cost is likely to rise over a multi-year holding period, in a way, the equivalent owner's principal and interest payment will not, though property tax, insurance, and maintenance costs on the ownership side will also rise with inflation, partially offsetting this specific renter side disadvantage. The most common homeownership counter-argument: renting is throwing money away, while a mortgage payment builds equity. This is a genuinely important point that deserves a direct, honest answer rather than dismissal. A portion of every mortgage payment does build equity. The principal repayment portion specifically reduces the loan balance and increases the homeowner's ownership stake in the property, separate from and in addition to any price appreciation the property itself experiences. The honest, complete answer to this counterargument: this is true, but it is not the complete picture, because the equity-building comparison must be made against what a renter does with the money they did not spend on the 7 hidden ownership costs from Segment 1, the down payment opportunity cost from Segment 4, and the difference between their rent and the full ownership cost if that money is instead invested rather than simply spent. A renter who invests the financial difference between renting and the full true cost of owning, not merely the difference in monthly payment alone, but the full comparison including all 7 hidden costs, is also building wealth, in the form of an investment portfolio rather than home equity. And which of these two forms of wealth building wins over a given time horizon depends entirely on the specific numbers involved: the home's actual price appreciation rate, the investment portfolio's actual returns, and the size of the gap between renting and full ownership costs that gets invested. Equity is not equivalent to liquid, productively invested wealth in every respect. Home equity, unlike a diversified investment portfolio, is concentrated in a single asset, one specific property in one specific location. Is illiquid. It cannot be readily accessed without selling the home or taking on additional debt through a line of credit, and its appreciation, while historically positive over most long-run periods in most Canadian markets, has not, in every market and every specific multi-decade period, outperformed a diversified equity investment portfolio over the same period. A comparison covered further in this channel's broader investing content. Your action step. When evaluating renting is throwing money away, explicitly ask the follow-up question this argument requires. Throwing money away compared to what specific alternative use of that same money? And is that alternative use, in this case, a diversified investment portfolio funded by the difference between rent and the full true cost of ownership, genuinely being compared on equal terms? This is the cost category referenced in Segment 1 that deserves its own full treatment, because it is frequently the single largest number in the entire comparison, and the one most consistently ignored even by people who remember every other cost on this list. The core concept: a down payment is not free money conjured from nowhere. It is capital that, in the alternative scenario where you choose to rent instead of buy, could be invested in a diversified portfolio rather than tied up in a home's equity. The return that capital could have earned, had it been invested instead, is a genuine, calculable opportunity cost of the decision to use it as a down payment. A specific illustrative calculation: a $120,000 down payment, 20% on a $600,000 home, invested instead in a diversified equity portfolio at a standard conservative long-run average annual return of 7%, held for 25 years. This capital alone, with no further contributions, would grow to approximately $650,000. This means the genuine cost of using that $120,000 as a down payment rather than investing it is not simply $120,000. It is the full $650,000 that capital could have become over a 25-year horizon, compared against whatever the home's actual equity, down payment plus principal paydown plus appreciation, is worth at the same point. Why this number is so consistently underweighted in casual rent vs. buy conversations. A home's price appreciation feels concrete, visible, and frequently discussed in casual conversation and media coverage, while a foregone investment return is abstract, invisible, and requires a deliberate mental exercise to even consider, because nothing visibly happens to demonstrate the cost. There is no statement, no notification, no event that makes the foregone $530,000 in this example, $650,000 minus the original $120,000, feel real or present in the way watching a home's assessed value rise does. This does not mean buying a home is therefore a bad financial decision. The complete, honest comparison requires weighing this opportunity cost against the home's own combined return, its price appreciation plus the value of the principal paydown that occurred through mortgage payments, plus, in many cases, the value of the housing costs the homeowner did not pay in rent over the same period, since the homeowner needed to live somewhere regardless of which choice they made. In many specific markets and time periods, the home's combined return has matched or exceeded what the down payment would have earned if invested instead. And in other specific markets and time periods, it has not. This is precisely why the comparison is genuinely circumstance-dependent, rather than universally resolved in either direction. The practical implication for running your own numbers. Any honest rent vs. buy calculation must include this opportunity cost explicitly as a line item on the buying side, not as an argument against buying, but as a required component of an accurate, complete comparison parallel to including the 7 hidden ownership costs from Segment 1 and the rising rent consideration from Segment 3. Your action step. Calculate what your own specific intended down payment amount would become if invested at a standard, conservative, long-run return assumption over your expected holding period, using a basic compound interest calculator, and include that specific number explicitly in your own rent vs. buy comparison rather than leaving it as an invisible, unconsidered cost. Here is how to assemble everything from this video into one complete, honest comparison, plus the genuine factors that no spreadsheet can fully resolve. Step 1. Calculate the full true monthly cost of owning. Mortgage principal and interest, plus property tax, divided into a monthly figure, plus insurance, plus an averaged monthly maintenance reserve, plus condo or strata fees if applicable. This is your full ownership monthly cost, not the mortgage payment alone. Step 2. Calculate the price-to-rent ratio for your specific property and a genuinely comparable rental. Using the framework from Segment 2, get a fast first read on which side the pure financial math is more likely to favor in your specific market. Step 3. Calculate the opportunity cost of your specific down payment over your expected holding period. Using the framework from Segment 4, with your own actual down payment amount and a standard, conservative, long-run return assumption. Step 4. Factor in your specific expected time horizon. This is the single most important variable this video has not yet fully addressed. The one-time costs of buying and selling a home, land transfer tax, legal fees, real estate agent commissions on an eventual sale, typically 4% to 5% of the sale price in many Canadian markets, are fixed regardless of how long you hold the property, meaning they get spread over more years and therefore matter proportionally less, the longer your expected holding period. A rule of thumb commonly cited in real estate and personal finance analysis suggests that buying tends to require a holding period of at least 5 to 7 years, in many typical markets, before the fixed transaction costs of buying and eventually selling are fully offset by the cost advantages buying may otherwise provide. Though this specific break-even period varies by market and by the specific numbers involved in your own calculation. The genuine non-financial factors that numbers cannot resolve. Stability and control over your living space. A homeowner cannot be asked to leave by a landlord, cannot have rent increased beyond legal limits where they apply, and can renovate or modify the property as they choose, carries real value for many people that does not appear in any of the financial calculations above. Flexibility and mobility. A renter can typically relocate for a job opportunity, a relationship, or a lifestyle change with considerably less friction, cost, and time than a homeowner attempting to sell a property, carries equally real value for others. Forced savings discipline. A mortgage payment is a structured, somewhat involuntary form of saving, which may suit individuals who know they would not otherwise consistently invest the difference if renting, is a genuine behavioral consideration, distinct from the pure financial mathematics. The honest conclusion: there is no universal answer to rent versus buy. There is only a complete, honest calculation of the financial factors specific to your city, your specific property, and your specific time horizon, combined with an honest acknowledgement of which non-financial factors matter most to your own life circumstances. And reasonable people doing this calculation honestly will continue to land on different answers, because the underlying inputs genuinely differ by person, by property, and by market. Your action step: run all 4 steps above using your own real numbers for your own specific city and property, rather than relying on a generic answer from this or any other single video, and weigh the result against your own honest assessment of the non-financial factors that matter most to you. Let's come back to where we started. The naive comparison, monthly rent versus monthly mortgage payment alone, omits at least 7 significant cost categories on the ownership side, and at least one significant consideration on the renting side, and that omission is never neutral. It systematically biases the conclusion toward buying, because most of what gets left out sits specifically on the ownership side of the ledger. You now have the complete framework: property tax, insurance, maintenance, mortgage insurance where applicable, land transfer tax and closing costs, condo fees where applicable, and the opportunity cost of your down payment, all weighed against the comparison most renters also get wrong: the rising cost of rent over time, and the honest, complete answer to whether a mortgage payment building equity actually beats the alternative of investing the difference instead. The price-to-rent ratio gives you a fast first read specific to your market. Your expected time horizon determines how much the one-time transaction costs of buying and selling actually matter to your specific situation. And underneath all of it, the non-financial factors, stability, flexibility, the value of forced savings discipline, matter enormously, even though no calculator can quantify them for you. This video will not tell you whether to rent or buy, because that would require pretending a universal answer exists when it genuinely does not. What it has given you is the complete, honest set of numbers that nobody hands you by default, so that whichever decision you make, you are making it with the real math in front of you, rather than the simplified, systematically biased version most people are shown.